In the early 1800s, America was divided. The North believed in freedom, but the South's economy ran on slavery. Millions of African men, women, and children were forced to work on cotton plantations, beaten, chained, and treated like property. One cold night, a young enslaved boy named Samuel whispered to his mother, "Mama, will I ever be free?" His mother replied softly, "One day, child, someone will hear our cry." Years later, that someone came. Writers like Frederick Douglass, once a slave himself, began to tell the truth, the pain, the injustice, the humanity behind every slave's eyes. Speakers like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman turned their pain into power. Tubman risked her life again and again, leading hundreds of slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Newspapers like The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison, spread the fire across America. Churches, schools, and towns began to stand up. "No man should own another," they cried. Then came the great clash, the Civil War. Freedom had to be won not by words but by courage. When the war ended in 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever. Samuel's dream finally came true, not just for him, but for millions. Freedom had a cost. But it also had a voice, and that voice changed a nation. It all began in the early 1600s. When the first ships from Africa reached the shores of Virginia, carrying people, not travelers, not guests, but captives. They were sold to English settlers to work on tobacco farms. That was the beginning of something dark, something that would grow for more than 200 years, slavery in America. At first, there were indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for a few years to earn their freedom. But as tobacco, rice, and cotton became more profitable, plantation owners wanted cheap, permanent labor. So they turned to the African slave trade. Ships filled with men, women, and even children crossed the Atlantic Ocean in brutal conditions. They were chained below deck, packed so tightly that many never survived the journey. This voyage was called the Middle Passage, a silent sea of suffering. When the ships reached the American South, the captives were sold like cattle, bought, branded, and forced to work under the burning sun. Plantations grew richer. Cotton and sugar filled ships bound for Europe. And the Southern economy boomed, all built on the backs of enslaved people. For the South, slavery became necessary. It was their foundation, their wealth, their pride. But for millions of enslaved Africans, it was a life of endless pain, no names, no rights, no freedom. Still, even in the darkness, whispers of hope began to rise. Enslaved people told stories, sang songs of freedom, and prayed for a day when chains would break. The roots of slavery were deep, planted in greed and watered by fear. But soon, new voices would rise to pull those roots from the soil of America forever. The year was 1688. In a small Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania, four men sat in silence. Outside, the world was changing, trade was booming, plantations were expanding, and slavery was growing like a shadow across America. But inside that quiet room, a question was born. One man spoke softly. "How can we call ourselves followers of God, while owning another human being?" These were the Quakers, simple, humble people who believed all souls were equal before God. They refused to fight wars, they refused to lie, and now, they refused to accept slavery. That day, they wrote a short but powerful document. The Germantown Petition Against Slavery. The first written protest against human bondage in American history. It didn't change the world overnight, but it planted the first seed of resistance. As years passed, more voices joined the call. In the 1700s, Quakers in Philadelphia and Rhode Island began freeing enslaved people and urging others to do the same. They formed small groups called abolition societies, communities where black and white reformers worked side by side. Men like Anthony Benezet, a quiet schoolteacher, wrote letters to kings and leaders, begging them to see that slavery was evil. He taught African children to read when the law said he couldn't. His belief was simple. If knowledge can make a man free, then let us teach until the chains fall. Soon, others were inspired. In 1775, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society became the first organized movement to fight slavery in America. It was joined by free African Americans, who spoke with courage about the truth of their lives. The Revolution for Independence came, people shouted freedom against Britain. But in the hearts of these reformers, freedom meant more than politics. It meant humanity. It meant justice. By the late 1700s, the idea had spread. From small Quaker meetings to towns, cities, and churches. The first sparks of freedom had been lit. And those tiny sparks would owe. He was born in 1818. On a Maryland plantation. No last name. No birthday. No freedom. Only a boy named Frederick, owned like property. He never knew his father, and his mother was taken from him when he was a child. All he had were chains, and questions. Why was he a slave? Why were others free? When Frederick was sent to work in the city, his new mistress began teaching him the alphabet. But when her husband found out, he shouted, "Learning will make him unfit to be a slave!" Those words lit a fire inside the boy. If knowledge was power, he would learn, no matter the cost. Frederick began teaching himself to read and write in secret. He traded bread for lessons with poor white boys in the streets. At night, he read old newspapers, learning about a world beyond slavery. And soon, his mind was free, even if his body was not. At the age of 20, he made a daring escape, disguised as a sailor, clutching borrowed papers. One step, one train, one heartbeat away from capture, until finally, he reached New York. He was free. But freedom alone wasn't enough. He had to speak, not just for himself, but for all those still in chains. Frederick Douglass began giving speeches. His voice was thunder. Crowds stood silent as he described the whips, the fear, the stolen childhoods. People couldn't believe that this tall, brilliant man had once been enslaved. He wrote his life story, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and it shook the nation. The book exposed the cruelty of slavery, the hypocrisy of the system, and the strength of a man who refused to be broken. But Douglass didn't stop there. He started his own newspaper, the North Star, with a message that burned in every issue. Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Through his words, he became a voice for freedom, equality, and dignity. Kings and presidents listened to him. But more importantly, so did millions of ordinary people. The night was silent. No moon, no light, only the whisper of footsteps in the dark woods. A woman led a small group through the shadows. Her name was Harriet Tubman. And every step she took was a step toward freedom, or death. Harriet was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822. As a child, she was beaten, starved, and forced to work in the fields. Once, when she tried to protect another slave from being punished, an overseer struck her head so hard that she suffered blackouts for the rest of her life. But even after that, her spirit refused to break. In 1849, Harriet decided, enough was enough. One night, guided by the North Star, she ran. Through swamps, rivers, and forests, hunted by men and dogs, until she finally crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state. She said, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. I felt like I was in heaven." But freedom wasn't enough for Harriet. Her family, her friends, they were still trapped in chains. So she went back. Once, twice, again and again, nearly 13 times, risking her life to bring others out of slavery. This secret path she used was called the Underground Railroad. Not a real train, but a network of brave people, safe houses, and secret routes that stretched from the south to the north. Harriet became one of its greatest conductors. She carried a gun, not for violence, but for courage. And she warned those she guided. "You'll be free, or you'll die." Over the years, she rescued more than 300 enslaved men, women, and children, and never lost a single passenger. They began calling her Moses, because she led her people to the promised land of freedom. During the Civil War, Harriet worked as a nurse, a spy, and even led a military raid, freeing more than 700 slaves in a single night. A woman who once had no power became a warrior for justice. Harriet Tubman's name became a symbol. That courage can rise. Boston, 1831. Snow fell softly on the streets as a young printer named William Lloyd Garrison locked himself in a tiny room with an old press, a stack of paper, and a burning idea. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But he had one weapon that could shake the world: his words. That night he printed the first issue of his newspaper, The Liberator. The headline blazed: "I will be heard." Garrison wasn't just calling for the end of slavery someday. He demanded it now. He wrote, "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." His words hit America like lightning. The South called him a traitor. Slave owners burned his newspaper in public. Bounties were placed on his head. But the North began to listen. For the first time, ordinary citizens read about the real horrors of slavery. Families torn apart, children sold, human beings treated as property. Garrison's pen became a mirror that forced America to see its own reflection. Soon, the Liberator spread everywhere, through churches, schools, secret meetings, and abolition societies. It gave courage to those who had none. It gave voice to the enslaved who could not speak. When Frederick Douglass read the paper for the first time, he said it felt like fire running through his veins. He later met Garrison, and together they turned the Abolitionist movement into a revolution of ideas. But Garrison's path wasn't easy. He was attacked by mobs, dragged through the streets, even nearly killed. Yet every week, without fail, he printed another issue. For 35 years, he never missed one. He believed that truth was stronger than hate. That words could cut deeper than chains. And when the Civil War ended in 1865, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever, Garrison printed his final edition of The Liberator. Across the front page, he wrote one last sentence: "My work is done." He laid down his pen. The pen that had. She was born in 1797, in a cold cabin in New York. Her name was Isabella Baumfree, but she was not free. She was a slave. Bought and sold again and again, separated from her family, beaten and silenced. But one night she made a decision. Enough. She walked away, barefoot, hungry, and alone, leaving behind everything but her faith. She said, "I did not run away. I walked away by the light of God." After she escaped, she gave herself a new name, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner, because she would travel from place to place spreading God's message. And Truth, because that's all she had to give. She couldn't read or write. But her words were sharper than any book ever printed. She spoke with a voice that shook rooms. A voice that carried pain, wisdom, and the power of centuries. In 1851, she stood before a crowd at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio. Most of the audience was white, and many didn't want a black woman to speak. But Sojourner stepped forward anyway, tall, strong, eyes blazing. And she began to speak. "That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. Nobody ever helps me into carriages, or over mud puddles. And ain't I a woman?" The room fell silent. "I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns. And no man could head me, and ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children. And seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman?" Every word struck like lightning. Her speech tore through prejudice, not just against race, but against women. She showed the world that strength, faith, and courage had no color, no gender. After that day, Sojourner Truth traveled across the country, speaking in churches, town halls, and even to President Lincoln himself. She spoke for freedom, for women's rights, for human dignity. And she never stopped. When asked if she was afraid to speak to powerful men, she said, Virginia, August 1831. The air was thick with heat, and with fear. In the small county of Southampton, a man named Nat Turner looked up at the sky and saw an eclipse of the sun. To others, it was just a shadow. To Nat, it was a sign from God. Nat Turner was no ordinary slave. He could read and write, a rare gift among enslaved people. He spent his nights reading the Bible, preaching to others in secret, telling them that God would one day deliver their people from bondage. But as the years passed, the whip cracked harder. The chains grew tighter. And the prayers went unanswered. So Nat decided, maybe God was waiting for them to act. He gathered a small group of trusted men, armed with axes, knives, and courage. They made a plan to rise up, to strike back, to bring judgment to the land of slavery. On the night of August 21, 1831, they moved silently through the dark. They began at Nat's master's house. Within hours, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Plantations burned, bells rang, panic filled the air. For 2 days, the rebels fought with everything they had, believing that freedom was finally within reach. But the South responded with brutal force. Militias, soldiers, and angry mobs hunted them down. Hundreds of black men, many who had nothing to do with the rebellion, were killed in revenge. Nat Turner went into hiding. But after 6 weeks, he was captured. When he was brought to trial, people expected him to beg for mercy. He didn't. He said calmly, "Was not Christ crucified?" Even at the gallows, his eyes were steady. He knew he would die. But he also knew that his story would not. Nat Turner's rebellion terrified the South. Slave owners passed stricter laws, forbidding education and gatherings for enslaved people. But it also woke up the nation, forcing Americans to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. The rebellion failed. But the message did not. It whispered through the years. In the songs of the enslaved. In the speeches, the year was 1850. America was growing, new lands, new states, new dreams. But behind that dream was a question tearing the country apart. Will slavery spread, or will it end? Every new state that joined the Union had to choose, free or slave. And every time a new state joined, the balance of power trembled. The North and South stood on opposite sides of a thin, cracking line. Politicians tried to save the nation with compromises. Paper bandages on a bleeding wound. In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise. Maine would be a free state, Missouri a slave state. And a line would divide freedom from slavery in the West. For a moment, the storm quieted. But only for a moment. 30 years later, the peace shattered again. After the U.S. gained vast new lands from Mexico, the question returned, would these new states allow slavery? Then came the Compromise of 1850. California entered as a free state. But the South gained the Fugitive Slave Act, a cruel law forcing Northerners to return escaped slaves. Even free black Americans were captured and sold again. Cities like Boston erupted in outrage. Crowds protested, shouting, "No human being is property!" The fight moved from Congress to the streets. A young politician named Abraham Lincoln warned, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." But others believed compromise could still hold the Union together. Then came 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It allowed settlers to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. What followed was chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, and the fields ran red. It became known as Bleeding Kansas. The time for talk was ending. The politicians' ink had dried. Now blood began to take its place. In the South, fear grew that slavery's end would destroy their world. In the North, fury rose that slavery's evil still lived on. Two halves of a nation, staring at each other like enemies, both unwilling to step back. Compromise had. The year was 1861. The United States, once united by revolution, was now divided by slavery. 11 Southern states broke away, calling themselves the Confederacy. The rest, the Union, stood with President Abraham Lincoln. And then, the first cannon roared at Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. At first, Lincoln's goal was simple: to save the Union. He didn't talk about ending slavery, not yet. He knew the nation was fragile, one wrong word, and it could shatter completely. But as the war dragged on, as bodies filled the battlefields, Lincoln's heart began to change. Every letter he received from abolitionists, every story of enslaved people escaping to Union lines, every cry for justice, it all reminded him that this war was about something greater than politics. It was about freedom itself. Then came the turning point, Antietam, September 1862. The bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 soldiers dead or wounded. But the Union held the field, a hard, bitter victory. Lincoln saw his chance. He sat alone in his study, pen trembling, and wrote the words that would change America forever. That on the first day of January 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't end slavery everywhere at once, but it gave the war a new purpose. Now, the Union wasn't just fighting to preserve a country. It was fighting to free a people. When Lincoln signed the document on January 1, 1863, he said softly, "I never, in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." Across the South, the news spread like wildfire. Enslaved men and women dropped their tools, knelt, and wept. Some sang hymns of freedom, others ran to join the Union Army, turning their chains into weapons of liberation. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had fought for the Union. Fighting not just